All right, so youth culture and activism. I'm going to have an interesting conversation today about this idea collectively of activism. Talk a little bit about environmentalism, feminism, Native American rights, etc. And we're going to start off with this conversation about youth culture. Um, just like with World War One, when soldiers come back from World War II, they're entering into this world of prosperity. And it's very interesting because, we're just emerging from the Great Depression. So, in many respects, for the soldiers coming home and starting families, settling down and ultimately creating a baby boom, this is the first taste of real adulthood prosperity that they've had because you've had the Great Depression. Then we moved straight into the World War. And now things are finally seeming to get better economically, politically, etc., for the United States. Um, and the same thing is happening after World War One as well. As these people settle down, if you remember that song "Little Boxes" that we listened to, where it's referencing this idea of a culture of conformity that's growing, the rise of these Levitt towns, these suburban areas. What you start to see is as those kids that are born into those communities get older, and in the 60s, about 58% of our population in the United States is under 35. That's the baby boomers. As those baby boomers start to get older, they look around and they realize that this prosperity that many of them have been born into is not actually accessible to many groups. And they grow frustrated with this mainstream culture that they see as being unsupportive of different and diverse identities and belief systems. They don't understand this America that has created what they see as a wealth gap and an aggressive military and, living in this Cold War era. So they're pushing back against what they think their parents have done wrong. It's rebellion. You see their children rebelling in a similar way in the 80s and 90s with this rise of yuppie culture, right? Everybody wants to be a businessman with the same haircut and work on Wall Street. That's the sort of prize there in the 80s, certainly in early 90s. So I mean, every generation rebels against their parents. But how do you rebel against a hippie? Well, you become a little bit more serious, right? But these are the hippies that we're talking about, these boomers, or this generation of change. And I've actually put in your folder for this week a whole bunch of different protest songs and protest movement that you're certainly free to listen to on your own time. But I'm going to play one for you here, and that's this Bob Dylan song, just because I love it so much. And it, I think, summarizes the direction where we're heading here in the 60s.
If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing. Some writers and critics, you prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are changing. Some senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he who has stalled. For the battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing. Some mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one be fast as the pressing now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and a first one now will later be last, for the times they are changing.
Okay, we're also going to be talking about the women's movement during this time period. A few women whose name you should know. Betty Friedan, certainly. There's a quote from her here: "A girl should not expect special privileges because of her sex, but neither should she adjust to prejudice and discrimination." Feminism is simply the belief that men and women should be treated equally. There are, in this 1970s, some calls for something called the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, to be passed, guaranteeing um, equal treatment for women under the law in terms of discrimination in the United States. That amendment is never passed. There's some really strong proponents or people in favor of the amendment, namely Gloria Steinem. Um, but there's also some really strong opposition, namely a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who is a really staunch anti-feminist. Let's see here. Oh, Betty Friedan. Speaking of Betty Friedan, 1963, she writes The Feminine Mystique, where she suggests that perhaps not all women are happy at home, and that it might even be possible for a woman to find happiness and fulfillment somewhere outside of the domestic sphere, should she so choose. If you remember the Bracero program, this time period where the United States government literally invites Mexican American workers, Mexican migrant workers, to come into the United States and work the fields in the American Southwest. That is going to bring an increase in Latino population to the United States. And with an increase in Latino population, we also see an increase in discrimination against Latinos. There's an example of some segregation at work. On the left, we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. You know, in the South, where there's a larger population of African Americans, you're going to see segregation against those individuals. And in the American Southwest, where there's a larger population of Spanish or Mexican Americans or migrant workers, you're going to see discrimination against those individuals. Make sure you pay particular attention to Cesar Chavez, who is going to organize a union, United Farm Workers, for Mexican migrant workers in the United States. Another group that's advocating for rights during the 60s, 70s are Native Americans. Native Americans are, as it says, a small minority but with significant challenges. Unemployment on a reservation is typically 10 times the national average. The amount of unemployment and poverty on reservations is incredible. And there is going to be a group that is going to attempt and successfully attempt to draw attention to this plight, and that is AIM, the American Indian Movement. They are oftentimes viewed as a militant group, but they do succeed in drawing attention to the plight of many Native American reservations. A couple of things that they do to garner attention. The first is they violently seize Alcatraz. So that's what this image is on the top right. The AIM group in Alcatraz says Indians welcome Indian property. United Indian property, right? Not United States property in Indian land. And they also seize Wounded Knee, the territory of Wounded Knee. Now, the leader of the American Indian Movement, or the leader of AIM, is a man named Russell Means, whose name you may see up here. And he successfully advocates and helps in Congress pass the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act, which literally brings Native American voices into the process of administering federal programs designed for Native Americans, and in the process increasing money for education. The disabled are also advocating for themselves in the 60s and 70s. You have some laws passed regarding federal buildings. Well, buildings of organizations that receive money by 1990 have to allow there to be handicap access, right? You need a wheelchair ramp, you need an elevator, you need accessible bathrooms, things that many people don't think about every day, but which are important for those with various types of disabilities. And then the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically something called Section 504, which you guys have actually may have heard of before. If anybody has a 504 plan, lots of people do, right? It says that no one with a disability can be discriminated against in any way by an entity that receives federal funding. So if you have something that you need to be addressed by the school and the school doesn't address it, then you have legal recourse for that, right? Environmentalism, the other sort of element of activism that we want to discuss in this section. Lots of concerns about the use of chemicals in the environment, particularly a chemical called DDT. I'm just going to draw your attention to this image down here in the bottom left, which is so concerning. It's a pesticide that they're spraying on the beach, and these kids are just running through the smog of it. Oh, it makes me so concerned. The mom in me is just snapping my fingers like, stop it. I don't even know what they're thinking. There's a nationwide ban for DDT by 1972. Prior to that, in 1962, a woman named Rachel Carson, there she is in the middle, wrote a really influential book called The Silent Spring, essentially saying if we don't stop spraying these pesticides and putting these chemicals into the environment, we're not going to have any birds, right? It's more than that, right? But you know, when you can tell it's spring, you can sort of hear the birds chirping out your window. Well, what if we have a silent spring? That's the premise of her book. We have the establishment of Earth Day, and Richard Nixon really does a lot for the environmental movement, even though he has obviously a lot of problems. He establishes the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It's during his tenure that we see the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970, the Endangered Species Act. This is also the time period, if you remember hearing about Love Canal or 3 Mile Island, but there's 2 videos on each of those environmental disasters in this folder. So this is just a really obviously very quick run through about some different groups that are actively advocating for themselves and others in the 1960s and 70s. This is not comprehensive. For example, the one thing that your book doesn't really mention that I would like to are the Stonewall riots. Stonewall is a club for homosexuals in the 50s and 60s. And in the 60s, so homosexual acts were illegal during much of the 60s. And so the police would from time to time raid the club. And there is an instance where the customers fight back, and it's called the Stonewall Riots. But it's considered to be the beginning of the LGBTQ human rights movement, if you will, or equal rights movement in the United States. So definitely, again, not a comprehensive conversation, but one that I think is interesting and hopefully will help you as you unpack some of the other things in your AMSCO. So reach out with any questions.